Hi, growth group leaders. It is October 27th, and I want to give you some instruction for the discussion you will have on Colossians 3:18 through 4:1. That's for the sermon that will come on November 13th. I'm doing this video in lieu of writing out instructions for you. So I hope you'll take a few minutes to watch this, and I hope this will be helpful to you. I'm not going to read the passage. You can do that yourself. Just stop the video and watch that. Paul is talking in this passage about relationships, basically three relationships: husband, wife, parent, child, master, slave. Why is he talking about relationships, and why should we talk about relationships? Well, we all have relationship difficulties, and anybody in your group has relationship difficulties. They may not speak a lot about it, but they do. And so it's important for us to address these. And an important concept that I think we get from the passage that maybe to us Americans is not so obvious is that there are roles that we have to play in life. Parents can't just be the friends of their children, can they? You really have to be a parent. You have to know what being a parent means. And husbands and wives have slightly different roles. And Paul wants us to understand how to live out our discipleship of Christ in these relationships in a way that honors Christ, in a way that expresses our union with Christ. So we need to talk about this. Now, in this passage, there are a couple of areas where it's easy to get sort of entangled in long discussions, and so you need to be prepared. The first one is this idea of submission of wives to husbands. Submission is not a popular concept today. You need to think a little bit about what that means. We have beliefs in our church about this, and I'll say something about that in just a minute. But you need to be kind of prepared that people may react badly to that, and you need to think about how you're going to speak about it. The second area where I think people may get tied up is the whole question of slavery. First century slavery was not as bad as the slavery that we experienced on this continent back in the 17th through 19th centuries. But it was bad. I mean, slaves were the property of their owners, and owners could even kill a slave without any legal consequences. Why didn't Paul just tell Christian slave owners to get rid of their slaves, to set them free? I don't really know. I think that the Christians were not in a position to make large changes in the social structure at that time, and so they had to live out their faith within the existing relationships and structures of their society. And so I think that what Paul says to Philemon about encouraging him to let Onesimus go free, and the things that he says to slaves about getting their freedom if they can, I think this suggests that Paul saw that slavery was not a just institution, but for whatever reason, he didn't think it right at that time to urge slave owners to manumit their slaves. And I don't fully understand why that is, but be prepared to talk about that. I think there are three key points you really want to bring out in your discussion this time, if you can. The first one is that all of our relationships are opportunities to serve Christ. Whether you're a husband, a wife, a child, a parent, an employer, an employee, in that relationship, in that role, you can serve Christ. And I think that that's something that really helps to transform our thinking about our relationships. The second point is that when you do bring Christ into relationships, it always helps to bring harmony to those relationships. Well, I guess not always. I mean, if you trust in Christ and your spouse doesn't, then there's going to be conflict because of Christ. But by and large, when we love other people in such a way that we're serving Christ in that relationship, that brings peace, it brings harmony, it fosters good relationships. And the third point I think that we want to make here is that the way Paul goes about discussing these relationships reminds us that the key question we have to be asking ourselves in every relationship is not, what does that person owe me, but rather, what do I owe that person? That's revolutionary. It changes everything about the way we think about our relationships. So some historical notes. In the typical Roman household, wives were expected to obey their husbands. Obey, not submit, obey. Paul softens that because Paul's view is that the husband is to be a leader in the family, spiritual leader, the one who's sort of taking the initiative in the relationship, maybe the one who has the final say in matters where there's disagreement, but not a dictator. The wife is not told here simply to obey, and the husband is certainly not told to demand his wife's obedience. Rather, the wife is told to submit. The husband is not a dictator. The husband is a leader, a loving leader, modeled on the example of Christ, as we learn in Ephesians chapter 5. This is what we believe at CCAC, that this is not simply something that was true in Paul's day. That is, that there was a submission of wives to husbands that pertained only to the first century, but not today. We believe, from looking at the rest of Scripture, that this is rooted in God's creation ordinance, God's creation plan. That from the beginning, God intended that husbands and wives should play different roles. Men and women are alike made in the image of God. We are of equal value before God. Men are not more important than women in any way. But God has given us order in our relationships. And in this case, the husband is supposed to take a leadership role. The wife then is to submit to that gladly, willingly, and in a way that encourages and helps her husband. Let me suggest some ways you can kind of go about this discussion. I think this one's hard because there's so many different ways you can go here, and the direction you go is going to depend somewhat upon who's in your group and what they want to talk about. But here are my suggestions. First, let's start with a question anybody can answer, QAA. And the one I suggest is a very simple one. Who is the best boss you ever worked for, and why? Pretty much everybody can answer that question. Almost everybody's worked for somebody before, and they either loved it or they hated it. And so a question like, who is the best boss you ever worked for and why, will get people talking. So give everybody in the group an opportunity to answer that question. You can come up with a different QAA. This is just my suggestion. It's a good one. Then read the passage aloud. Have people take turns reading verses. And then maybe start asking questions like this. Start not by looking at the individual relationships, but in a more general way. Ask this question. How does Paul see Christ involved in each of these three relationships? Now, if you look closely, Paul keeps saying things like, wives submit as is fitting in the Lord, and he says to the masters, treat your bondservants fairly and justly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. He keeps bringing Christ into these relationships. So ask people to look closely at the text and find these places where Christ is mentioned. He's not mentioned in regard to the husband loving his wife, but you can point out, excuse me, that in Ephesians 5, he does bring Christ into the picture. Then you can say something like, all of our relationships are opportunities for us to serve Christ. How does bringing Christ into these relationships change them? Let people talk about that. Let them bat it around a little bit. Then, sorry. In the next section, you might say something like this. In the ancient world, it was assumed that wives and children and slaves would obey. And it was assumed that husbands and fathers and slave owners had almost unlimited authority over them. And so in the ancient codes, you never have husbands being told to love their wives. You never have fathers being told not to be harsh with their children. It's assumed that wives have to obey. It's assumed that children have to obey, that slaves have to obey. But what Paul does here is he, first of all, speaks to the person who has the kind of the leadership role in each of these relationships and says something that moderates greatly that person's authority. Don't be harsh with your wives. Don't be harsh with your children. Don't be harsh with your slaves. So he speaks to the person who is dominant in the relationship and warns them not to abuse that relationship. He also, and this is maybe even more important, he speaks to the person who is in the more subordinate position, whether it's a wife or a child or a slave. And he says to that person, submit, obey, or obey gladly. He's treating those people as people with a right to choose and a power to choose. He's treating them as responsible human beings and giving them dignity in doing so. And so I think you can point that out if people don't bring it out themselves. And then you can say, well, then how does this transform these relationships? Because what this does is it means that the question each one of us has to ask is not, what does that person owe me? But what do I owe to that person? So the husband doesn't ask, well, what does my wife owe me? I'm not to stand around saying, why aren't you submitting to me? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? I'm to look at myself and say, am I loving you the way Christ loves the church? The parent doesn't simply look at the child and say, obey, 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 obey. We do insist that our children obey. But we also are asking ourselves, what do I owe that child? How do I help that child come to a a relationship with God in which they see God as a father who really loves them and cares for them? How do I guide them without frustrating them or exasperating them? If you're an employer, you don't simply say, here's what my employee owes me. You say, what do I as an employer owe to my employee? So the way Paul sets this up, he makes these mutual relationships in which everybody has a responsibility. Everybody has a way of serving Christ. Everybody has a way of demonstrating submission to Christ in the way that they conduct themselves in the relationship. So it transforms everything. And if we follow Paul's example here, and follow his teaching, we're going to find our relationships improving. So I encourage you to ask questions to bring out these key points. And then at the end, I suggest that you give them a very practical question for discussion. Something like, practically speaking, how does the gospel help you in your relationships? Or you could even make it more specific. Tell us how the gospel helps you in one of your key relationships, and let them talk about that. As in the past meetings, I would suggest you leave the last 20 minutes or so for prayer. So if this discussion isn't done by that time, then just let them take it into the small group. They can answer this last question, this application question. How does the gospel help you in these relationships? They can answer that in the small group and then pray for one another. I think this is a pretty good approach to this text. It's going to be hard to control because there will be people who want to talk about husbands and wives, people who want to talk about parents and children. Somebody's having a real hard time with their child and they want to bring this up. And you need to leave some room for that. But try to get to the key points that I've already mentioned. And then try to get to the point where you can ask people to talk about what they can do and how Christ's gospel is going to influence their relationships in this coming week. Thanks. Good luck to you. Thank you for your ministry. God bless. Bye-bye.